The church was quiet in the way that only the most significant moments ever are. Not silent, quiet, the kind of stillness that settles over a room when everyone present understands, without being told, that something irreversible is about to happen. Flowers lined the aisle. Guests turned in their seats. And at the back of that church, a young woman in white stood at the threshold of the rest of her life, her hand resting gently in the crook of a man's arm. That man was not her father. Her father had been gone for 8 years. Taken on a November afternoon in 2013, on a road in Valencia, California, at the age of 40. Gone before he ever got the chance to see her become who she was standing there being. And so it was someone else beside her. A man she had known almost her entire life. A man her father had trusted above almost anyone else on earth. A man who, by every public account, had stepped into the role of protector, godfather, guardian, the steady presence that held the shape of what Paul Walker had left behind. Vin Diesel walked Meadow Walker down the aisle in October 2021. The world saw it. The world wept over it. And the world told a very specific story about what that moment meant. That Vin had shown up for her. That he had honored his promise. That the big, unbreakable man had carried Paul's daughter safely to the next chapter of her life. But that story, as moving as it is only half true. Because what Meadow Walker has been quietly revealing for years, not in any single interview, not in any one statement, but in the accumulated weight of 100 small, deliberate, deeply personal choices, is that the real story runs in the opposite direction. The world believes Vin Diesel has been holding Meadow Walker together since her father died. What Meadow has been showing us, for anyone willing to look carefully enough, is that she has been holding him. That is Vin Diesel's secret, and she is the one who exposed it. To understand what was lost, you have to understand what those final 2 years contained. Meadow Rain Walker was born on November 4, 1998, in Los Angeles. Her mother, Rebecca Soteros, made a deliberate choice early on to raise her daughter away from the gravitational pull of Paul's fame. And so Meadow grew up in Hawaii, barefoot and sun-drenched, shaped more by ocean tides than Hollywood spotlight. She was, by every account, a free and grounded child. The kind of kid who found more meaning in the texture of coral than in the gloss of a film premiere. Paul visited. He called. He was present in the ways a father could be when geography separates a family. But presence through a phone is not the same thing as presence at the breakfast table, and both of them knew it. Then in 2011, when Meadow was 13 years old, she made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She packed her things, left Hawaii, and moved to California to live with her father. It was not a small choice for a teenager. It was an act of want. The specific, urgent want of a daughter who had decided she needed more of her father than distance allowed. What followed were 2 years that almost no one talks about with any real depth. Paul Walker, by that point, was one of the most recognizable faces on the planet. The Fast and Furious franchise had turned him into a global star. His schedule was relentless, his public obligations endless. And yet every person close to him during those years says the same thing, that Meadow changed him. That having her there, in his house, in his daily life, softened something in him that fame had been quietly hardening for years. He spoke about her in interviews with a quality of reverence that he never applied to anything else. Not cars, not films, not the franchise that had made him rich. He said once, simply and without performance, that fatherhood was his greatest role. He meant it. You could hear that he meant it. And then, on November 30th, 2013, with Meadow 15 years old and those 2 years of real, daily, irreplaceable closeness still so new, it ended. A Porsche Carrera GT on Hercules Street. A tree. A fire. And a girl who had only just gotten her father back, suddenly having to learn how to live in a world that no longer contained him. The grief that followed was not the manageable, publicly processed kind. It was the kind that restructures a person at the cellular level. Meadow was surrounded by family, by support, by an entire extended cast of adults who loved her father and wanted to love her in his name. But there is no support network on earth that closes the specific gap left by a parent taken too soon. Among all those who gathered around her, one figure stood apart. Not because he was louder or more present than the others, but because of a promise. A promise Paul Walker had made certain before he ever needed to. He had named Vin Diesel as Meadow's godfather. Not as a courtesy. Not as a Hollywood formality between co-stars who liked each other. Paul Walker did very few things for show. This was a decision made in full knowledge of what it meant. That if the worst happened, he wanted this specific man standing in the specific gap. The question nobody has asked loudly enough is, why? What most people know about the friendship between Paul Walker and Vin Diesel is the surface version. Two men who met on a film set in 2001, discovered a mutual love of cars and competition, built something real between takes, and called each other brothers. All of that is true, but the texture of their friendship was stranger and more tender than the public mythology allows. These were not two men who bonded over machismo and horsepower alone. They played video games together in secret during downtime on set, logging into World of Warcraft under anonymous usernames so no one would know, competing alongside each other in a digital world that had nothing to do with cameras or franchises. They talked about family with an intimacy that surprised people who knew them separately. Vin, who had spent much of his early life constructing a persona of impenetrability, found in Paul someone with whom that armor could come off. Paul called him Pablo. Vin called Paul his brother. And when Vin's partner Paloma gave birth to their third child in March 2015, 4 months after Paul died, Vin stood in a hospital room and named that baby girl Pauline. Think about what that means. Not the gesture of it, which is visible and moving, but the private reality of it. A man, standing in the most tender moment a human being can inhabit, the arrival of a new life, and choosing to make that moment also about the one he'd lost. Choosing to say the name out loud. Choosing to give his daughter the weight of carrying it forward. There were no cameras in that room. No press release had been prepared. No franchise was being served. It was just a man, alone with his grief and his love, doing the only thing he could think of to keep his friend close. That name, Pauline, is the most honest thing Vin Diesel has ever said publicly about what Paul Walker's death did to him. And here is the open wound at the center of everything that followed. Vin Diesel was not just grieving a friend. He was finishing his friend's film. The production of Furious 7 is one of the most emotionally brutal stories in modern Hollywood history, and it has been told so many times that people have stopped actually hearing it. So hear it again differently. When Paul died, the film was roughly half shot. The studio had decisions to make, and they made the humane one. They would finish it, they would honor him, and they would do it properly. Paul's brothers Cody and Caleb stepped in to help complete his remaining scenes using digital technology. The cast returned to work. And Vin Diesel, who had just lost the closest friend he had ever made in this industry, went back in front of cameras and pretended to be Dominic Toretto. He has spoken about breaking down on set, about having to stop, about crew members going quiet in the middle of takes because the grief in the room became too heavy to film through, about driving the car in scenes that Paul should have been beside him for and feeling the absence like a physical pressure. He finished the film. He delivered his performance. And then he stood on a stage at the MTV Movie Awards in April 2015 and delivered a tribute that left an audience of thousands completely silent before they wept. But here is what nobody saw. Here is the part Meadow has been slowly, gently illuminating for years. While Vin was publicly performing strength, while he was being the Rock, the Godfather, the keeper of the legacy, the man who named his daughter Pauline and walked Meadow down the aisle and posted tributes on every anniversary, he was privately unraveling in ways that only one person seemed to fully understand. Meadow Walker. She was 15 when her father died. 16 when she launched the Paul Walker Foundation on what would have been his 42nd birthday. 17, 18, 19. Building her grief into something structural and purposeful while the adults around her struggled to find their footing. And somewhere in those years, something shifted in her relationship with Vin Diesel. She began sending him Father's Day messages. Not because anyone asked her to, not as a public gesture, but because she had been watching him and she understood something about him that his public image carefully concealed. That the man who told the world he was protecting Paul Walker's daughter was also a man who did not know how to carry what Paul Walker's death had left inside him. She was not his ward. She was his witness. By the time Fast X entered production, Meadow Walker was 23 years old, married, running a foundation, living a life entirely her own. She had no professional obligation to the franchise her father had built. She had every right to keep her distance from a film set that would have required her to walk back into the most complicated emotional territory of her life. She chose to walk in anyway. Her cameo in Fast X, a brief appearance as a flight attendant in a scene with John Cena, was not about career. It was not about tribute in the conventional sense. It was not even, if you listen carefully to what she said about it, entirely about her father. It was about Vin. "It did something to my soul," he said when asked about her presence on set. He said it quietly. He said it in the way people speak when they are trying to describe something that language cannot fully reach. Think about what it cost her to give him that. To walk onto a film set knowing that every person there would be watching her face for signs of Paul. To stand in a franchise that exists, in part, as a monument to her father's death. To smile through a scene, to get the take right, to do it well. Not for herself, but because the man who had been publicly called her protector quietly needed her there more than she needed to be. That is the dark secret the title promised you. Not a scandal. Not a betrayal. Something far more confronting than either of those things. The secret is that Vin Diesel, this man of granite performance and cinematic invincibility, has been held together, in the years since November 2013, by the quiet and deliberate grace of a young woman who lost more than he did and somehow found it in herself to give anyway. Meadow did not expose something shameful about Vin Diesel. She exposed his humanity, his need, the vast, private tenderness of a grief he has never known how to carry alone. She exposed the fact that the godfather needed the goddaughter, that the protector needed protecting, that the promise Paul Walker extracted from his best friend was perhaps, in some way Paul understood better than anyone, as much for Vin as it was for Meadow. There is a version of Paul Walker's story that ends in November 2013 and stays there. Frozen, burnished, set behind glass like something too precious and too broken to touch. Meadow Walker has refused that version. She has kept her father alive not by preserving him in amber, but by moving forward with everything he gave her. His love of the ocean, his instinct for service, his willingness to show up for people even when it cost him something. The Paul Walker Foundation has funded marine science scholarships, environmental research, and conservation projects that will outlast every film in the franchise his name helped build. She has done this work without performance, without positioning, with the quiet, purposeful determination of someone who learned, in the hardest possible way, that love is not a feeling. It is a practice. She married Louis Thornton Allen in October 2021. Vin Diesel stood beside her. His eldest daughter stood behind her as maid of honor. The entire composition of that wedding was a statement, not about what had been lost, but about what had been built in the aftermath. A family that did not exist before tragedy created the conditions for it. A bond forged not in joy but in the specific, unlikely alchemy of shared grief. Paul Walker was everywhere in that church. In the flowers, in the silence, in the way Vin held his arm just slightly too carefully, as though aware he was holding something that did not belong to him and must be delivered with absolute care. He was also, somehow, in the way Meadow walked, steady, unhurried, unafraid. That is his legacy. Not the franchise, not the cars, not the billion-dollar box office returns. His legacy is a daughter who learned from him how to move through the world with her whole heart open, and who has spent a decade doing exactly that, even for the people who needed her more than she needed them. Vin Diesel once wrote, on what would have been Paul's 50th birthday, "The tears never go away, but they change. We only hope to make you proud." He was writing to Paul. But the person who has most made Paul Walker proud is not the man who named his daughter after him, or the franchise that put his image on billboards across the world. It is the girl from Hawaii, the one who moved to California at 13 because she wanted more of her father, the one who was given 2 years and made them last a lifetime, the one who turned 15 in the wreckage of loss and somehow grew into a woman who gives more than she takes, loves more than she guards, and has quietly, without fanfare or agenda, become the most honest thing the Fast and Furious family has ever produced. Meadow Walker did not expose a scandal. She exposed something rarer and more valuable than that. She exposed what her father was made of, because she is made of the same thing. If the story moved you, share it. Because stories like this, the real ones, the ones underneath the headlines, are the ones that deserve to be remembered.